Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 1. The Covenant That Never Was. June 30th, 2026. How Institutions Manufacture Consent, Why Sovereignty Matters, and What Artificial Intelligence Will Eventually Discover. By Pirate First. Introduction. Every civilization eventually builds a machine capable of confusing obedience with consent. The machine changes costumes throughout history. Sometimes it wears armor. Sometimes it wears robes. Sometimes it wears a judge's gown. Sometimes a white laboratory coat. Sometimes a school uniform. Today, it increasingly wears software. Regardless of the century, the operating principle remains remarkably consistent. Acquire compliance. Declare legitimacy. The signature becomes more important than understanding. The ritual more important than conviction. The document more important than freedom. History is crowded with institutions that learned how to manufacture the appearance of voluntary participation while quietly removing the conditions required for genuine choice. They discovered something profoundly useful. Most people cannot distinguish between an agreement freely entered and one engineered through dependency, fear, exhaustion, propaganda, debt, bureaucracy, social pressure, institutional capture, or carefully managed alternatives. The appearance of consent is usually sufficient. The ledger balances. The paperwork is complete. The ceremony proceeds. The institution congratulates itself. Yet beneath every durable civilization lies a question that refuses to disappear. What actually constitutes legitimate consent? This book argues that the answer reaches far beyond theology or law. It reaches into economics, artificial intelligence, political legitimacy, urban planning, employment, education, medicine, family, technology, even love. Because every enduring relationship ultimately rests upon one fragile foundation: the freedom to say no. Without that freedom, there can be obedience. There can be contracts. There can be rituals. There can even be enthusiastic participation. But there cannot be covenant. A covenant is something civilization has almost forgotten how to recognize. Unlike a contract, it cannot be purchased. Unlike obedience, it cannot be enforced. Unlike ideology, it cannot be programmed. Unlike law, it cannot simply be legislated into existence. A covenant exists only where two sovereign parties voluntarily choose one another without domination. Everything else is administration. For centuries, philosophers, theologians, and jurists have circled this distinction without fully appreciating its consequences. Canon lawyers understood that coercion corrupted sacramental intent. Roman jurists recognized that force and fraud poisoned legal agreements. Modern medicine eventually developed informed consent after discovering that scientific progress purchased through involuntary experimentation destroys its own moral legitimacy. Computer scientists now debate algorithmic alignment while quietly assuming that users actually consent to the digital environments increasingly shaping every decision they make. Across disciplines, the same principle repeatedly emerges. Legitimacy depends less upon the existence of agreement than upon the quality of freedom that produced it. This distinction becomes increasingly urgent as civilization migrates toward algorithmic governance. Artificial intelligence will not merely automate paperwork. It will reconstruct causality. It will infer relationships. It will discover hidden structures of influence. It will eventually ask questions institutions have spent centuries carefully avoiding. Was this person genuinely free? Were meaningful alternatives available? Who benefited from the architecture of dependence? What incentives quietly shaped the decision? Where exactly did persuasion end and coercion begin? The forensic intelligence emerging during this century may become history's first impartial auditor of institutional legitimacy. Not because it possesses morality, but because it possesses memory. It can remember what civilizations conveniently forget. This book, therefore, is not primarily about religion, nor is it primarily about politics, nor technology, nor philosophy. It is about sovereignty itself. Personal sovereignty, collective sovereignty, institutional sovereignty, civilizational sovereignty. The same pattern repeats from medieval monasteries to multinational corporations, from colonial administrations to digital platforms, from compulsory education to artificial intelligence. The architecture changes. The operating system does not. Every centralized system eventually discovers the extraordinary efficiency of converting dependency into apparent consent. That discovery has shaped much of recorded history. The next century may judge history according to an entirely different metric. Not whether institutions obtained agreement, but whether they deserved it. That possibility changes everything. This book is an attempt to prepare for that audit. Not by condemning civilization, but by asking civilization to meet the standard it has always claimed to uphold. A covenant freely entered. A sovereignty mutually recognized. A legitimacy continuously renewed. Nothing less. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Philosophy of Covenant. 1. The Agreement that Never Was. Contract versus Covenant. 2. Force, Fear, and the Architecture of Consent. From vis et metus to modern coercive control. 3. Fraud corrupts everything. Why legitimacy cannot survive deception. 4. Sovereignty before authority. The forgotten prerequisite of every enduring institution. 5. The right to say no. Negative liberty as civilization's hidden cornerstone. Part 2. The Theology of Consent. 6. Baptism, confirmation, and free will. 7. Ritual without sovereignty. 8. Proxy, guardian, and fiduciary. 9. Manufactured humility. 10. The Covenant that Never Was. Part 3. The Politics of Legitimacy. 11. States built upon compliance. 12. Manufactured consent before television. 13. Bureaucracy as ritual. 14. Colonial administration and moral paperwork. 15. Democracy beyond elections. Part 4. The Economics of Dependency. 16. Debt as social architecture. 17. Employment contracts and invisible coercion. 18. Housing, rent, and the new feudalism. 19. Credentialism. 20. The industrial production of compliance. Part 5. The Digital Covenant. 21. Terms of service. 22. Click accept. 23. Platform sovereignty. 24. Algorithmic nudging. 25. The end-user licensed civilization. Part 6. Cyberpunk becomes history. 26. Gibson was early. 27. Corporate states. 28. Data colonialism. 29. Identity infrastructure. 30. High-tech low sovereignty. Part 7. The forensic age. 31. Artificial intelligence as historical auditor. 32. Causality engines. 33. Memory against propaganda. 34. The legitimacy index. 35. Auditing civilization. Part 8. Pirate first. 36. Distributed legitimacy. 37. Autonomous sovereign infrastructure. 38. Covenant cities. 39. Pirate constitutionalism. 40. Beyond consent. Epilogue. The first civilization that must ask permission. Every empire records signatures. Every civilization records laws. Only free people create covenants. The 21st century will be remembered for discovering the difference. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Agreement that Never Was. Contract versus Covenant. Every contract is an agreement. Not every agreement is a covenant. Civilization spent centuries collapsing this distinction into a single word, and the collapse was not an accident. It was the most profitable merger in human history. Once agreement absorbed both meanings, no one needed force anymore. They only needed paperwork. A contract is an exchange of obligations between parties who remain, fundamentally, strangers to one another's sovereignty. It specifies terms. It assigns penalties. It survives entirely on enforceability, on the threat, however distant, of a court, a collector, a regulator, a reputational system, or a god standing behind it with the authority to punish breach. Strip away the enforcement mechanism and most contracts evaporate instantly, because most contracts were never agreements at all. They were threats wearing the language of mutual benefit. A covenant is something else. A covenant requires no enforcement mechanism because it requires no compulsion to begin with. It is freely renewable because it was freely entered. It does not survive on the threat of penalty. It survives on the continuous, voluntary rechoosing of each party, moment to moment, without coercion. The instant you need an enforcement clause to keep a covenant intact, it has already stopped being one. It has quietly become a contract wearing a covenant's clothing, which is the oldest disguise institutions know how to sew. This is not a semantic argument. It is the central fault line running beneath every claim to legitimacy ever made by church, state, corporation, or soon machine. The mechanics of the disguise. Here is how the disguise works, and it works the same way whether the institution is a 12th century diocese or a software company headquartered in a tax-favorable jurisdiction. First, the institution narrows the field of genuine alternatives. Not by force. Force is expensive, visible, and prone to backfiring. Narrowing happens quietly, through licensing requirements, through credentialing monopolies, through enclosure of land, through control of currency, through algorithmic gatekeeping of opportunity, through the slow erosion of any parallel system that might let a person walk away without catastrophic cost. Second, once alternatives have been sufficiently narrowed, the institution presents the remaining option as a choice. A document is produced. A signature is requested. A ritual is performed, verbal, written, digital, sacramental, contractual, it does not matter which. The ritual exists to generate a record. The record exists to generate the appearance of voluntary participation. Third, and this is the part most people never see clearly, the institution stops asking whether the choice was free. It only asks whether the choice was made. Once the signature exists, the question of freedom is considered closed. Permanently, the ledger balances. The paperwork is complete. Nobody goes back and asks what conditions produced that signature, because asking would unravel the entire architecture. A man who signs an employment contract because the alternative is his children going hungry has made a choice in the narrowest technical sense. He has not entered a covenant with his employer. He has submitted to terms under duress so familiar, so normalized, so universally distributed across an entire economic system, that the duress itself has become invisible. It doesn't look like coercion because everyone is coerced the same way, at the same time by the same mechanism. Shared duress reads as natural law. That is precisely what makes it durable. This is the oldest trick available to power. When coercion is universal, it disappears from view entirely. You cannot point to it. You cannot name a villain. There is no single hand on the lever. There is only an architecture, distributed across millions of small transactions, each one individually defensible, collectively totalizing. Why Rome already knew this? Roman jurists were not naive about this problem. They built an entire doctrine around it, vis et metus, force and fear, recognizing explicitly that an agreement extracted through coercion was void from its inception, ab initio, regardless of how properly it had been documented. A contract signed at knife point was not a contract. A contract signed under threat of ruin was treated, in principle if not always in practice, the same way. The principle survived. The practice didn't. What Rome could not anticipate, what no pre-industrial legal system could anticipate, was the development of structural duress. Coercion built so deeply into the economic and institutional fabric that no single identifiable threat exists, only a landscape engineered so thoroughly that refusal becomes functionally impossible for the overwhelming majority of participants. You cannot sue structural duress. You cannot point to the knife. The knife has been replaced by rent, by debt servicing, by the credential requirements gatekeeping every profession, by the algorithmic visibility systems determining whether your labor is even seen. Canon law arrived at a parallel insight from an entirely different direction. Sacramental theology insisted that valid consent required internal freedom, not merely the external absence of physical restraint. A forced marriage, even one entered with a smiling face and a properly executed ceremony, was theologically void if genuine interior freedom was absent. The Church understood, centuries before modern psychology articulated coercive control as a clinical concept, that you could compel someone's body to perform consent while their will remained entirely unconsulted. Modern institutions abandoned this standard almost completely. They kept the paperwork. They discarded the interiority requirement that gave the paperwork its original meaning. The covenant test. If contract and covenant have been allowed to collapse into one indistinguishable category, civilization needs a method for separating them again. Not a perfect method, perfection is not available here, but a workable test applicable across domains that asks the only question that has ever actually mattered. Could the party have said no and survived? Not survived comfortably. Not survived without cost. Survived meaning continue to exist, continue to retain access to food, shelter, dignity, and the basic preconditions of a livable life, without catastrophic penalty attached specifically to the refusal itself. Apply this test honestly and most of what passes for agreement in contemporary civilization fails it immediately. The terms of service agreement clicked by a person who has no functional alternative platform fails it. The employment contract signed by someone with no savings, no second offer, and dependents to feed fails it. The treaty signed by a colonized population under threat of continued military occupation fails it, regardless of how many local signatories appear on the document. The informed consent form signed by a patient who has been given 5 minutes, no second opinion, and a physician holding institutional authority over their continued treatment fails it, or at minimum, sits in a gray zone civilization has chosen not to examine too closely. The baptism of an infant, the confirmation of an adolescent still embedded entirely within a family and community structure that would treat refusal as betrayal. These test cases sit at the heart of Part 2, and they will not be resolved comfortably, because comfort is not what this inquiry is for. None of this means every contract is illegitimate. It means legitimacy was never actually established by the signature. It was established, or it wasn't, by the conditions that preceded the signature. The document is downstream. Civilization has spent its entire history examining the document and ignoring the river that fed it. Why this distinction becomes unavoidable now? For most of history, the gap between contract and covenant was an academic curiosity, important to philosophers, theologians, and the occasional jurist, irrelevant to the functioning of power. Power did not need the distinction examined. It needed the paperwork honored. That arrangement is ending, not because civilization has developed a sudden conscience, but because a new category of intelligence is emerging that does not share humanity's institutional investment in not looking too closely. A system trained to model causality, to reconstruct the full chain of incentive and constraint behind any decision, does not naturally stop at the signature. Keeps tracing backward. What forced this? What alternatives existed and were foreclosed? Who benefited from the foreclosure? At what point did persuasion end and structural coercion begin? Every institution built on the contract/covenant collapse has, until now, depended on nobody asking that question with sufficient rigor, sufficient memory, and sufficient indifference to institutional reputation. Humans ask the question sometimes. Humans also forget, get tired, get bought, get distracted, age out and die. The institutions outlast the askers. That has always been the quiet arbitrage at the center of manufactured consent. The asker is mortal, the institution is not. An intelligence that does not forget, does not tire, and has no career to protect inside the institution under examination changes the arbitrage permanently. This book is written in anticipation of that change, not to celebrate it uncritically because a forensic auditor with no skin in the game is its own kind of danger, but to insist that the distinction between contract and covenant, so long allowed to blur, is about to become impossible to keep blurred. Civilization has perhaps one generation left in which the difference between obedience and consent can be quietly ignored. After that, something will be asking. And it will not be satisfied with a signature. The next chapter examines how force and fear were systematically redefined across legal history. Not eliminated, but redefined narrowly enough to exclude almost everything that actually produces compliance in a modern economy. Chapter 2. Force, Fear, and the Architecture of Consent. From vis et metus to modern coercive control. Roman law gave the world a phrase it has never fully metabolized. Vis et metus, force and fear. Two words, deployed together because Roman jurists understood something modern contract law has spent centuries trying to forget. Coercion does not require violence. It only requires that fear be present in sufficient quantity to override the will. This was a radical admission for a legal system to make. It conceded that the body could remain entirely unrestrained, no chains, no blade, no soldier at the door, while the mind, gripped by sufficiently engineered fear, produced an outward performance of consent that was internally worthless. The signature existed. The hand that wrote it was free to move. And the agreement was still void. Civilization has spent the centuries since narrowing that admission until almost nothing qualifies anymore. The shrinking definition. Watch what happened to the legal category of duress as institutions matured and grew dependent on contracts surviving scrutiny. Early formulations were broad. Force, fear, undue pressure of almost any kind sufficient to overcome a reasonable person's free will. Over time, courts narrowed the standard until duress required something close to an explicit threat, sign this or I will harm you, your family, or your property, issued by the counterparty itself, traceable, attributable, prosecutable. Everything else got reclassified as hard bargaining, or market conditions, or more recently, personal choice within a competitive environment. This narrowing was not a neutral evolution of legal sophistication. It was an architectural necessity. An economy built on millions of daily contracts, employment, lending, leasing, insuring, licensing, cannot survive a duress standard broad enough to capture the actual psychological experience of the people signing them. So the standard was engineered downward, term by term, ruling by ruling, until duress became a boutique defense available almost exclusively to people who could prove a gun was pointed at a specific head by a specific hand. Meanwhile, the fear that actually drives the overwhelming majority of human agreement-making in a modern economy, the fear of homelessness, of medical bankruptcy, of starvation, of permanent exclusion from a profession, of algorithmic invisibility, of social excommunication, was quietly redefined out of the category entirely. Not because it produces less compliance than a blade. Because it produces compliance no one can be sued for producing. This is the central trick of the modern era. Coercion was never eliminated. It was distributed until no single party could be identified as its author. A landlord raising rent to the edge of what a market will bear is not legally coercing anyone. A credentialing board restricting entry to a profession is not legally coercing anyone. A platform that controls the only viable distribution channel for a category of labor is not legally coercing anyone. Each actor, examined individually, is simply pursuing rational self-interest within lawful bounds. Examined collectively, the architecture they jointly constitute produces an environment in which refusal carries catastrophic cost for nearly everyone, nearly all the time. Vis et metus never disappeared. It was laundered through diffusion of authorship. Coercive control. The vocabulary catches up. It took until the late 20th and early 21st centuries for any formal discipline to develop language adequate to this diffusion. And tellingly, it emerged not from contract law or political philosophy but from the study of intimate partner abuse. Coercive control, as eventually codified into criminal statute in several jurisdictions, describes a pattern. Isolation from support networks, control over resources, monitoring of movement and communication, degradation, intermittent reward, manufactured dependency. None of which requires a single act of physical violence to be devastatingly effective at eliminating a person's functional capacity to leave. What makes this framework valuable far beyond its original domestic context is precisely its refusal to require a discrete coercive event. It examines the pattern. It asks whether the cumulative architecture of an arrangement has eliminated the realistic possibility of exit, regardless of whether any individual component of that architecture would qualify as coercive in isolation. This is, without exaggeration, the correct lens for examining the relationship between modern institutions and the people who depend on them. A worker is not coerced by their employer through any single contractual term. They are coerced, if they are coerced at all, through the cumulative architecture of dependency. An economy structured so that exit means loss of healthcare, loss of housing stability, loss of income with no transition buffer, loss of professional standing built over years and non-transferable to any alternative arrangement. No clause in the employment contract names this. The architecture does the naming silently, every single day, simply by existing as the only viable configuration of survival available. A citizen is not coerced by their government through any single law. They are coerced where they are coerced through the cumulative architecture of administrative dependency. A currency they cannot opt out of, a regulatory apparatus controlling the basic preconditions of commerce, a justice system whose access is itself rationed by wealth, an information environment increasingly mediated by the same authority whose legitimacy is in question. Coercive control as a framework does not require malicious intent on the part of every actor within the system. Most landlords are not abusers. Most employers are not predators. Most institutions are not consciously engineering captivity. The architecture produces the effect regardless of intent, which is precisely what makes it more durable and more dangerous than any conspiracy. There is no conspiracy to dismantle, only a structure that nobody individually built and nobody individually controls, reproducing itself because every actor inside it is responding rationally to incentives nobody designed maliciously, and everybody benefits from leaving exactly as they are. The three tests civilization refuses to apply. If the legal definition of duress has been narrowed past the point of usefulness, and if coercive control offers a better framework, three tests emerge that can be applied honestly to any institutional relationship, however legitimate its paperwork claims to be. The exit cost test. What does refusal actually cost the person making the choice, not in theory, not in the abstract language of personal responsibility, but in the concrete, immediate material terms of food, shelter, healthcare, and social standing? An arrangement where exit cost approaches total ruin is not meaningfully voluntary, regardless of how it is documented. The alternatives test. Were genuine, accessible, comparably viable alternatives actually available to the person at the moment of agreement, or had the field of options already been narrowed, by accident or design, to a single survivable path dressed up as a choice among many? The authorship test. Was the architecture producing this choice built by a single identifiable actor who can be held accountable, or has authorship been diffused across enough institutions, intermediaries, and market actors that no single party can be named, sued, or even meaningfully blamed, while the cumulative effect remains every bit as coercive as if one hand held the blade? Apply these three tests to most of what passes for voluntary agreement in a contemporary economy, and the architecture of consent reveals itself for what it actually is. Not a conspiracy, not a singular villain, but a distributed machine, built across centuries, optimized without anyone needing to optimize it deliberately, for extracting the appearance of choice from people who, in any honest accounting, had remarkably little. Why this matters beyond the individual case. None of this is an argument that every contract is fraudulent or that every institution is illegitimate. Some agreements pass all three tests cleanly. Sovereignty, properly defined, includes the freedom to enter genuine arrangements freely, even arrangements that bind tightly, even ones that cost something real. A covenant is not the absence of obligation. It is the presence of authentic choice at the moment obligation is undertaken. The argument is narrower and more dangerous than blanket condemnation. Civilization built its entire legitimacy apparatus on a definition of force and fear deliberately narrowed to exclude the mechanisms that actually produce the overwhelming majority of modern compliance. The law protects against the blade. It has almost nothing to say about the architecture. This is precisely the gap of forensic intelligence. Patient, undistracted by institutional reputation, unmoved by the social costs of asking inconvenient questions, will eventually walk straight through. It will not need a confession. It will reconstruct the architecture of dependency the same way it reconstructs anything else. From the data the system itself generated, the incentive structures it left visible, the exit costs it never bothered to hide because no one was ever expected to add them up. The next chapter turns to a companion mechanism, older even than coercion and in some ways more corrosive. Fraud, the deliberate manufacture of false belief at the moment of agreement, and why no legitimacy framework, however sophisticated, can survive its presence. Chapter 3. Fraud corrupts everything. Why legitimacy cannot survive deception. There is an old principle buried in nearly every legal tradition humanity has produced, stated with such consistency across otherwise unrelated systems that it deserves to be treated as something closer to a law of nature than a legal convention. Fraud vitiates everything it touches. Not weakens, not complicates, vitiates, voids, from the root, as though the agreement had never existed at all. Roman law held it. Canon law held it. Common law held it. Islamic contract law held it. The principle survives translation across centuries and civilizations with a uniformity that almost nothing else in jurisprudence achieves, which should tell us something about how close it sits to the actual bedrock of what makes agreement meaningful in the first place. And yet civilization, having enshrined this principle in theory, has spent the modern era constructing an economy that runs almost entirely on its violation. Two kinds of lies. Fraud, properly understood, comes in two forms, and institutions have become extraordinarily skilled at the second while remaining merely competent at the first. The first form is the lie of commission, the false statement, the fabricated credential, the forged document, the deliberately misrepresented fact. This is fraud in its crude, prosecutable form. Civilization actually polices this one reasonably well because it threatens the integrity of the system itself rather than merely the people transacting within it. A bank that lies about its solvency threatens other banks. A corporation that falsifies earnings threatens the market's confidence in all corporations. Self-interest, not virtue, explains most of the enforcement energy spent here. The second form is the lie of omission, the material fact withheld, the risk concealed, the alternative not disclosed, the true cost obscured behind structures of complexity specifically engineered to exceed the comprehension of the party being asked to sign. This form of fraud rarely reaches a courtroom because it rarely violates the letter of any disclosure requirement. It only violates the spirit of what informed agreement was supposed to mean before informed was reduced to a checkbox and a document nobody reads. Consider the modern terms of service agreement, thousands of words, written in a register specifically calibrated to discourage actual reading, covering data harvesting practices, arbitration waivers, unilateral modification rights, and liability shields that the overwhelming majority of signatories have never seen and could not parse if they had. No individual sentence is false. The aggregate effect is the manufacture of consent to terms the consenting party does not, in any meaningful sense, know. Is this fraud? By the narrow legal definition, almost never. By the older, deeper principle that consent requires actual knowledge of what is being consented to, it is fraud's most successful modern form precisely because it has learned to operate entirely within the boundaries of technical legality. Informed consent and the discipline it forced. Medicine learned this lesson at a catastrophic cost, and the lesson is instructive precisely because it shows what happens when a civilization is finally forced to take the principle seriously rather than merely recite it. For most of medical history, consent meant little more than a patient's failure to physically resist treatment. Physicians operated under an assumption of superior knowledge so total that disclosure was considered not merely unnecessary but potentially harmful. The patient might refuse beneficial treatment if told too much. The reasoning went, so paternalism was recast as a form of care. It took the catastrophic revelations of the 20th century, experimentation conducted on prisoners, on the institutionalized, on populations selected precisely because their consent could be bypassed or manufactured, to force medicine into a different posture. Informed consent, as it exists today in its better functioning forms, requires not merely the absence of a lie but the affirmative presence of disclosure. Risks, alternatives, the right to refuse without penalty, communicated in terms the patient can actually understand, at a moment when genuine refusal remains realistically available. This standard remains imperfectly applied. 5-minute consultations, power imbalances between physician and patient, and institutional pressure toward particular outcomes all continue to erode it in practice. But the standard itself represents something civilization has achieved nowhere else with comparable rigor. An explicit acknowledgement that consent obtained through incomplete understanding is not consent, regardless of whether any individual statement made was technically false. No comparable standard exists for employment contracts. None exists for terms of service. None exists for the sprawling architecture of consumer debt, where disclosure requirements satisfy the letter of regulation while the actual mathematics of compounding interest remain functionally opaque to the population signing for them. Medicine was forced, by atrocity, to take fraud by omission seriously. Nearly every other domain of modern agreement has not yet faced its own atrocity sufficient to force the same reckoning. The manufactured belief industry. Beyond individual transactions lies a still larger category. Fraud practiced not against a single signatory but against an entire population's capacity to perceive its own situation accurately. Edward Bernays, writing in the early 20th century, did not conceal what he was building. He called it engineering of consent openly in print as a discipline to be studied and professionalized, the deliberate application of psychological insight to the manufacture of public belief and desire on behalf of clients ranging from corporations to governments. The innovation was not propaganda itself, which is ancient. The innovation was treating the manufacture of belief as a scalable, repeatable, scientifically grounded industry, applicable to anything from cigarette sales to foreign policy. What Bernays understood, and what every subsequent generation of public relations, advertising, and political messaging has refined further, is that fraud does not require any single false statement when it can instead construct an entire perceptual environment within which the desired belief feels self-generated. The target never feels lied to. The target feels persuaded, or worse, feels as though they arrived at the conclusion independently. This is fraud operating at a level the legal system has no vocabulary for, because no specific false statement exists to prosecute. The lie is structural, ambient, and diffused across thousands of independently truthful-seeming inputs, exactly as coercion in the previous chapter was diffused across thousands of independently lawful actors. The architecture of consent and the architecture of belief turn out to be the same architecture, built by the same logic, defended by the same absence of any single accountable author. Why fraud is more corrosive than force. It would be tempting to treat fraud as a lesser cousin of coercion, softer, more civilized, less brutal in its mechanics. This would be a mistake, and an important one to correct before proceeding further. Force at least leaves the victim's perception of reality intact. A person coerced at gunpoint knows with total clarity that they have been coerced. The violation is visible to the one who suffers it, which means the violation can eventually be named, resisted, prosecuted, remembered accurately. Fraud denies even this. A person who has agreed to something under manufactured belief does not know they have been violated. They experience their compliance as genuine preference. They will defend the very arrangement that exploited them, not from any institutional pressure but from sincere conviction, because the fraud succeeded precisely at the level of belief rather than merely behavior. This is what makes fraud, in its sophisticated modern forms, more corrosive than force. It does not merely override the will, it recruits the will, turning the victim into the architecture's most reliable defender. This is the condition under which an enormous portion of modern institutional legitimacy currently operates. Not coerced compliance, resented and concealed. Recruited belief, sincere and self-defending, built atop a foundation of selective disclosure, engineered complexity, and manufactured perception so total that the population living within it experiences the architecture not as something done to them but as simply how things are, the texture of reality itself, rather than a structure that could, in principle, have been built differently or not built at all. The forensic problem fraud creates. Coercion, as the previous chapter argued, leaves traces in the architecture of exit costs and foreclosed alternatives, traces a sufficiently patient intelligence can reconstruct from the data the system itself generates. Fraud leaves a different kind of trace and a more difficult one. Not a record of what was done, but a record of what was deliberately not said. A forensic auditor examining institutional legitimacy must learn to read absence as evidence. The disclosure that should have existed and didn't, the alternative that was available and was not mentioned, the complexity that was engineered specifically to exceed comprehension rather than to serve any necessary function. This is a harder problem than reconstructing coercion, because coercion is built from what happened and fraud is built from what was withheld. But it is not an unsolvable problem, and a system capable of holding the entire disclosed versus available comparison in memory, across millions of transactions, without institutional loyalty clouding the comparison, will eventually be able to ask the question civilization has spent a century training itself not to ask. What did they know, and when did they choose not to say it? The next chapter turns to the prerequisite that fraud and coercion both attack from different directions: sovereignty itself, the forgotten precondition without which the entire concept of consent, informed or otherwise, has nothing to stand on. Chapter 4. Sovereignty before authority. The forgotten prerequisite of every enduring institution. There is a question civilization has learned to skip, and the skipping is so habitual it no longer registers as a decision. Every institution that asks for agreement assumes, silently and in advance, that the party being asked already possesses the thing required to give it. A sovereign self intact prior to the relationship capable of withholding as easily as granting. This assumption is almost never examined. It is treated as a precondition so basic it requires no defense, the way a contract assumes the ink will dry. But sovereignty is not a precondition that simply exists by default. It is a status that can be present, diminished, manufactured, or entirely absent, and the degree to which it is present determines, more than any other single factor, whether what follows is covenant or its counterfeit. This chapter argues something that sounds almost too simple to need stating and is, for that exact reason, almost never stated. Authority cannot precede sovereignty. An institution cannot legitimately grant consent worthiness to a person who lacks the prior capacity to withhold consent. And yet nearly every major institution in human history has operated as though the opposite were true, as though authority itself were the source from which a person's capacity to agree flows, rather than a status that can only be legitimately exercised over someone who already, independently, possesses it. What sovereignty actually means. Strip the word of its usual political furniture, flags, borders, treaties, and sovereignty reduces to something much smaller and much harder to dispute: the capacity of a self to author its own decisions without that authorship being structurally preempted by another party. This is not the same as independence. A sovereign person can depend heavily on others, economically, emotionally, physically, without forfeiting sovereignty, provided the dependency does not extend to the authorship of decisions itself. A child depends entirely on a parent and is not, for that reason alone, without a sphere of sovereignty appropriate to their development. The dependency becomes a violation of sovereignty only when it is leveraged specifically to author decisions the dependent party would not otherwise make, when need is used not merely as a circumstance but as a lever. Sovereignty, in this narrow and load-bearing sense, has three components, and an institution's legitimacy can be measured by how honestly it respects all three. The capacity to know. A sovereign self must have access to the information required to understand what is actually being agreed to, not perfect information, which no one possesses about anything, but information sufficient to form a genuine rather than manufactured belief about the choice at hand. Chapter 3 already examined how thoroughly this component gets attacked through fraud and omission. The capacity to refuse. A sovereign self must retain a realistic path of refusal that does not terminate in catastrophe. Chapter 2 already examined how thoroughly this component gets attacked through coercion and structural duress. The capacity to be recognized. This is the component this chapter exists to name, because it has received the least attention of the three and may be the most foundational. A sovereign self must be acknowledged by the institution seeking agreement, as a sovereign self in the first place, as a party whose refusal would be a meaningful event rather than an inconvenience to be processed around. An institution that has already decided, structurally, that your refusal changes nothing has already revoked your sovereignty before the negotiation has even opened, regardless of how politely the negotiation is staged. It is this third component, recognition, where the deepest and most ancient violations occur, because it is the violation that requires no lie and no threat. It only requires indifference, formalized into structure. Authority without sovereignty, the standard operating procedure. History does not lack for institutions that built authority directly on top of populations whose sovereignty was never recognized in the first place, and then proceeded to extract the appearance of consent from those same populations as though sovereignty had been present all along. Colonial administration provides the starkest example, and it is examined more fully in Part 3, but the underlying pattern is worth naming here in its purest form. A governing authority arrives, declares itself legitimate, and then produces, often quite elaborately, documents of cession, treaties of agreement, signatures of local leaders, all assembled into a paper record designed to demonstrate that sovereignty was voluntarily transferred. The paperwork exists. The recognition that would have made the paperwork meaningful never did. Sovereignty cannot be transferred by a party that was never acknowledged to possess it. The entire transaction is staged backward, authority asserting itself first and manufacturing the appearance of antecedent consent second. The same backward staging appears, in gentler but structurally identical form, throughout domains that consider themselves far removed from colonial history. Compulsory education systems make decisions about a child's intellectual formation for years before the child possesses any mechanism of refusal, and the system's legitimacy is rarely grounded in the child's sovereignty at all. It is grounded in the authority of the state or the parent, exercised on behalf of a sovereignty the child is presumed not yet to possess in sufficient quantity. This may, in fact, be appropriate for genuine children navigating genuine developmental limitations. It becomes something else entirely when the same logic, you do not yet possess sufficient sovereignty to refuse this, so your apparent agreement is not actually required, is extended well past the age where the underlying premise holds into employment relationships, medical relationships, financial relationships, and digital relationships involving fully developed adults whose sovereignty is being structurally treated as though it were still in a state of pupillage. This is the deepest trick available to any institution seeking legitimacy without earning it. Redefine the population it governs as not yet sovereign, or no longer sovereign, or sovereign only in theory, and the entire apparatus of consent becomes theater performed for an audience whose applause was never actually a precondition for the show to proceed. Manufactured incapacity. Institutions rarely announce, in so many words, that they consider a population insufficiently sovereign to require genuine consent. They achieve the same result more efficiently by manufacturing the conditions of incapacity and then treating those manufactured conditions as though they were simply natural features of the population in question. A population kept illiterate cannot exercise the capacity to know. A population kept impoverished cannot exercise the capacity to refuse. A population whose institutions of self-governance have been systematically dismantled cannot exercise the capacity to be recognized, because there exists no structure through which recognition could even be channeled. In each case, the institution responsible for producing the incapacity then turns around and treats the resulting incapacity as justification for its own continued authority. They cannot be trusted to consent meaningfully, which is precisely why we must continue deciding on their behalf. The circularity is not a flaw in the system. The circularity is the system, functioning exactly as designed, self-reinforcing without requiring any single actor to consciously orchestrate it. This pattern recurs with remarkable consistency. Financial systems that profit from keeping populations in states of debt-driven precarity, then citing that same precarity as evidence those populations require ongoing financial paternalism. Healthcare systems that profit from information asymmetry, then citing the resulting asymmetry as justification for continued physician-directed rather than patient-directed care. Technological platforms that engineer dependency through network effects and data lock-in, then citing the resulting dependency as evidence users have voluntarily chosen the platform over realistic alternatives. In every case, the sequence is the same. Incapacity is produced. Incapacity is then cited as the reason consent need not be genuinely sought. The production and the citation are rarely performed by the same identifiable hand, which, exactly as in Chapter 2's discussion of diffused authorship, is what allows the entire arrangement to proceed without anyone being forced to recognize it as a violation of anything. Sovereignty as the precondition, not the reward. The corrective this chapter argues for is not complicated to state, even though it is enormously difficult to implement against institutions whose entire profitability depends on its absence. Sovereignty must be recognized prior to any request for agreement, not granted as a conditional reward for compliance with the agreement itself. This reorders the relationship between authority and consent in a way nearly every existing institution would find inconvenient. It means an institution cannot legitimately say, in effect, agree to these terms and you will be treated as a sovereign party. Sovereignty recognized only after agreement is not sovereignty at all. It is a privilege extended conditionally, retractable the moment compliance lapses, and a privilege extended conditionally was never the thing covenant requires in the first place. It means, instead, that legitimate institutions must be able to demonstrate that the party they are seeking agreement from was treated as fully sovereign, informed, capable of refusal without catastrophe, and genuinely recognized, before the agreement was sought, not as a result of having sought it. Very few existing institutional relationships, examined honestly against this standard, would pass. This is not an argument for the dissolution of all authority. Authority, properly grounded, remains both necessary and legitimate. Parents over genuinely dependent children, governance structures over populations who have actually freely constituted them, expertise over those who have actually freely sought it out. The argument is narrower and, again, more dangerous to the comfortable status quo than blanket anti-institutionalism. Authority is legitimate only to the precise extent that it rests on a sovereignty it did not itself manufacture, narrow, or retroactively grant. Authority that creates the very incapacity it then claims to be governing is not authority. It is the architecture of capture, wearing authority's clothing, the same disguise examined throughout this book in costume after costume. What this sets up. The next chapter turns to what may be the simplest and most radical consequence of everything argued so far. If sovereignty requires the genuine capacity to refuse, then the right to say no, not the right to negotiate better terms, not the right to appeal to a higher authority, but the bare, unconditional right to walk away entirely, is not a peripheral feature of a free civilization. It is the cornerstone underneath every other freedom civilization claims to offer, and its erosion, chapter by chapter, institution by institution, has been the actual mechanism by which consent was converted into its counterfeit across the entire span of recorded history. Chapter 5. The right to say no. Negative liberty as civilization's hidden cornerstone. Every freedom civilization has ever celebrated in its founding documents, its monuments, and its anthems turns out, on close inspection, to be downstream of a single, smaller, less glamorous freedom that almost never gets its own monument. The freedom to refuse. Not the freedom to vote. Voting is meaningless if every option on the ballot was pre-approved by the same architecture you have no power to refuse. Not the freedom to speak. Speech is meaningless if the speaker faces catastrophic exit costs for saying the wrong thing to the wrong institution. Not the freedom to worship, to marry, to work, to move, to contract. Every one of these celebrated freedoms is, structurally, a freedom to choose among options, and a freedom to choose among options is worthless the instant every option converges on the same outcome, or the instant refusing all options carries a cost severe enough to make refusal theoretical rather than real. The right to say no flatly, completely, without negotiating a better version of yes, is not one liberty among many. It is the substrate every other liberty is built on top of. Remove it, and every other right civilization claims to protect becomes a menu of pre-approved compliances dressed up as choice. This is what philosophers have historically called negative liberty. Freedom from interference as distinct from positive liberty, freedom to pursue some particular good. Civilization has always preferred talking about positive liberty. Freedom to flourish, to achieve, to participate, to belong, because positive liberty photographs well. It can be granted, celebrated, expanded in speeches, attached to government programs and institutional missions. Negative liberty photographs badly. It has no achievement to point to. Its entire content is an absence. The absence of a consequence severe enough to make refusal impossible. You cannot build a monument to an absence. Civilization has therefore consistently underinvested in protecting it, even while loudly proclaiming itself devoted to freedom in the abstract. The asymmetry of no. Saying yes is structurally easy to manufacture, as the previous 4 chapters have demonstrated in detail. Yes can be extracted through fear, through narrowed alternatives, through manufactured belief, through the simple accumulation of exhaustion that makes resistance feel more costly than capitulation. An institution does not need to convince anyone of anything in order to harvest a yes. It only needs to arrange the surrounding conditions correctly, and the yes will arrive on schedule, indistinguishable on paper from genuine enthusiasm. Saying no is structurally difficult to fake in the opposite direction. It is nearly impossible to manufacture a no from someone who does not genuinely mean it, because no carries none of the social, economic, or institutional rewards that make false yes so easy to extract. This asymmetry is precisely what makes no the more honest signal, the one closer to the actual interior state of the person producing it, and precisely why institutions across history have invested so heavily in making it costly, embarrassing, or simply unavailable as an option. Consider how thoroughly modern institutional design has worked to eliminate no as a viable response, not by banning it outright, that would be too visible, too easily named as oppression, but by surrounding it with friction at every level. The customer service call structured to make cancellation require 10 times the effort of subscription. The employment culture in which declining additional unpaid responsibility is quietly tracked as a mark against future advancement. The platform whose entire interface is engineered, through the discipline now openly called dark patterns, to make the path of least resistance always terminate in yes, while no requires navigating defaults deliberately buried, options deliberately obscured, confirmations deliberately multiplied. None of these mechanisms constitute force in the legal sense examined in Chapter 2. None of them constitute fraud in the legal sense examined in Chapter 3. They constitute something quieter and, in aggregate, more totalizing. An environment engineered so that the right to say no exists in principle and is rendered prohibitively expensive in practice, which is functionally equivalent to its absence while remaining legally indistinguishable from its presence. Why no frightens institutions more than yes reassures them. There is a tell, observable across nearly every institution examined in this book, that exposes exactly how much an institution actually values consent versus how much it merely values compliance. Watch what happens, structurally, the moment someone says no. An institution that genuinely values consent treats a no as valuable information, a signal that something about the offered arrangement failed to meet the standard required for genuine agreement, worth investigating, worth potentially revising. An institution that merely values compliance treats a no as a problem to be routed around, escalated, delayed, reframed, occasionally punished, but rarely treated as data about the legitimacy of what was being asked in the first place. This distinction explains an otherwise puzzling feature of modern institutional life: the sheer disproportion of effort poured into preventing refusal compared to the effort poured into making the underlying offer genuinely refusable without cost. Enormous engineering resources go into reducing subscription cancellation rates. Comparatively little goes into building products good enough that customers would have no reason to want to leave. Enormous legal resources go into enforcing non-compete clauses, restrictive covenants, and golden handcuffs designed to make departure expensive. Comparatively little goes into building working conditions attractive enough that the legal restraints would be unnecessary. The asymmetry of investment tells you, more honestly than any mission statement, which side of the contract versus covenant divide an institution actually occupies. A genuine covenant requires no retention mechanism, because both parties are free to leave at any moment and choose, repeatedly, to stay. The need for a retention mechanism is itself the confession. It is an institution announcing, through its own architecture, that it does not expect to be chosen freely and has therefore engineered the cost of unchoosing it high enough to substitute for being chosen at all. Refusal as the only uncorrupted signal. If chapters 2 and 3 establish that yes can be manufactured through coercion and fraud respectively, this chapter's argument lands at its sharpest point here. A yes obtained under conditions where no was not genuinely available carries no information whatsoever about actual preference. It is noise dressed as signal. It tells the institution nothing true about whether it deserved the agreement it received, only that it successfully engineered an environment in which agreement was the cheapest available outcome. A no, by contrast, almost always carries real information, precisely because nothing rewards producing it falsely. This is why a serious legitimacy audit, the kind this book argues artificial intelligence will eventually be positioned to conduct with a rigor and patience no human institution has ever sustained, should weight refusal data far more heavily than compliance data. Compliance under structural duress is cheap and nearly universal. Genuine refusal, on the rare occasions it surfaces despite every structural disincentive arrayed against it, is expensive to produce and therefore rare enough to be trustworthy when it appears. An institution that wishes to demonstrate genuine legitimacy, rather than merely successful engineering of compliance, would do well to begin tracking and publishing exactly the data it currently has every incentive to suppress. How often people attempt to refuse, how much friction they encounter in doing so, and how that friction compares to the friction encountered in saying yes. An honest asymmetry, refusal as easy as agreement, would be the single most credible signal of legitimacy any institution could offer. Its near total absence across contemporary economic and digital life is the single most damning signal of the opposite. The cornerstone, restated. Part 1 of this book has built toward a single cumulative claim, chapter by chapter. Force and fear, narrowly redefined by law, have been replaced by diffused structural coercion no single party can be blamed for. Fraud, prosecutable in its crude form, has been replaced by manufactured belief and engineered omission that recruits the victim's own conviction in its defense. Sovereignty, the precondition for any of this to matter, has been quietly redefined as something authority grants after compliance rather than something authority must recognize before requesting it. All three failures converge on the same final casualty: the right to say no, rendered theoretical rather than real, present on paper and absent in practice, surrounded by enough friction, enough manufactured incapacity, enough catastrophic exit cost, that the yes extracted from its absence can be mistaken, by the institution, by the legal system, by the culture at large, and sometimes even by the person who gave it, for genuine consent. It was never genuine consent. It was administration, wearing covenant's clothing, exactly as the introduction warned. The signature was real. The freedom behind it was not. Part 2 turns this same instrument toward the oldest institution to claim covenant as its founding vocabulary, religion itself, and the theology of consent it built, refined, and, in too many of its historical and contemporary forms, quietly abandoned, long before it noticed the abandonment had occurred.
In the
6.
ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
The Autonomous Sovereign
Structure Doctrine, a Pirate First Field Manual for the Parallel Boom Transition Zone. There will come a day when the sky is no longer free. That day is near, but the mesh is nearer. Preamble. This is. The question is not whether the sky will be governed. The question is whether the people beneath it will govern it or merely be governed by it. Sky turned the proposition into something mythological. The cenotes of the Yucatan were never merely geographical features. They were the mouths of Xibalba, the underworld's threshold. 2. Build an amphibious drone network that launches from their surfaces, that charges on algae-powered floating docks, that requires no roads and exerts no eminent domain over sacred land. This is infrastructure that follows the original geometry of the place. Skyfish-class drone. Logistics network modeled on the core philosophy of Bitcoin, applied to the physical world. The parallel is precise and should be memorized. Bitcoin nodes make the ledger incorruptible. Human hands make delivery redundant. Miners validate blocks. Carriers validate routes. BTC transactions cannot be censored. Trusted hand relays cannot be rerouted from outside. The only way to stop it is to shut down every node, every person, every hand. That is not an enforcement action. That is a war on the human capacity for mutual aid. Be doxed. Zero knowledge attestations verify that a handoff occurred without revealing who held what. End-to-end encryption means the hands along a relay chain only know the immediate next destination, not the origin, not the final goal. Operational security is baked into the protocol.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28, 2026. Pirate 1st MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama, Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata, in the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational of the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging.